Well, if there's an important screencast out of all the ones in this unit, this might be the one, because this is the basics about how fiscal policy works and what kind of fiscal policy the government, Congress, and the president together use to try to manage the economy. Um, I'm going to be drawing in graphs in this one, and for some reason I can't stop messing up with the little software for today. So I'm going to see how that goes, and I hope you'll excuse me if it goes badly. So maybe I'll just take a good luck cup of coffee. Sip. All right, so let's try to get started. Going back to the two tools of fiscal policy, government spending and taxes, the government uses those to solve essentially two problems. And the two problems are basically just the opposites of each other. Sometimes aggregate demand is too low, and we call that a recession, and sometimes it's too high. And the idea is that the government can move where aggregate demand is to make it just right, kind of like Goldilocks. So let's start with the case of aggregate demand being too low. Again, there's a place we want equilibrium to be happening. We want it to be happening at full employment. And here it's just simply not. It's happening at too low a level. There's lots of reasons for that. We've talked about why that might happen. And remember, it's equilibrium that determines price level, GDP, and employment. And those are the variables that we're trying to move. All right. So when the government wants to push aggregate demand to the right, when it wants to increase aggregate demand and make GDP go up and employment go up, it uses what's called expansionary fiscal policy. And I think of the word expansionary simply as just making bigger, right? We're trying to make GDP bigger, we're trying to make employment bigger. So it's used when aggregate demand is too low, when GDP and employment are too low, we call that a recession. And it takes those two tools and it uses them in a specific direction. With government spending, it tries to increase it, right? That's flowing more money into the economy. And you can think about why that works, right? You go out, you build a road, those construction workers get paid, they take their money and they buy whatever construction workers buy, rent, food, beer, prostitutes, whatever. And that money gets respent, but I don't know what prostitutes buy. I don't. But it continues to flow throughout the economy, right? And we get more spending. Alternatively, you can cut taxes. Because by cutting taxes, again, you're giving people more money and they spend more money, and on it goes. And here's the first inkling of where the political debate often is, right? Because if you have to do expansionary fiscal policy and you're a liberal, you might want to increase government spending. You might want to spend more money on the projects that you care about, especially. If you're conservative, you don't. If you're conservative, though, you have this other tool, cut taxes, right? If you cut taxes on people, they spend more money, and on it goes. All right, so those are the two tools and how they would use those two tools if aggregate demand is too low, if there's a recession. And again, here's what it would look like, and let's analyze each of those tools, okay? So let's say that equilibrium's happening at $500 billion. That's GDP, right? That's where AD is crossing AS right now. That's obviously well below full employment according to this graph. So let's say the government starts spending money on whatever, a tank program, mission to Mars. Let's say that they spend $5 billion, and let's assume that MPC is equal to 0.75. Now you'll remember this $5 billion is going to turn into more spending depending on MPC. The multiplier, and there's the formula for the multiplier. If MPC is 0.75, the formula is going to be 1 over 1 minus 0.75, which is 1 over 0.25, which is equal to 4. So that spending is going to get multiplied by 4. To figure out how much GDP is going to go up in the end, you take the multiplier again and multiply it by that change in spending. And here what's going to happen is that $5 billion in spending that the government does will get turned into actually $20 billion more by the time it's done. All right, so for the first adventure into the little graphing thing. When the government initially spends that $5 billion, aggregate demand will shift to the right by $5 billion. Now the way we represent the multiplier in this graph is to simply show that here's the initial. change in spending, 5 billion. But once the multiplier effect gets through with what it does, that initial change in spending of 5 billion turns into a lot more spending, and in the end, 20 billion. So this new level of GDP right there, in this example, would be 520. And that initial change right there, this would be 505. All right, I hope that made sense, right? The first little jump is the initial spending, and it gets multiplied into more spending. Okay, now it's a little bit different if the government cuts taxes. If the government cuts taxes, let's assume by the same amount as it was spending before, 5 billion, and keeping MPC as 0.75, you'll remember the tax multiplier is different than the spending multiplier. If I cut your taxes by $100 and your MPC is 0.75, you're going to take 25 of those dollars and put them in the bank. That won't be spent. So a $5 billion tax cut would turn into a $15 billion change in GDP in this example. Here, the tax multiplier, negative MPC over MPS, negative 0.75 divided by 0.25, that's negative 3. So if I cut your taxes by 5 and it gets multiplied 3 times, $15 billion change in eventual GDP. And so there's a little lesson here, and it kind of enters the debate, if it's a sophisticated enough debate between liberals and conservatives, between Republicans and Democrats. In this example, that same $5 billion goes a lot farther, or at least a little bit farther, when it's government spending than when it was a tax cut. In other words, when you have to do expansionary fiscal policy, government spending is a bit more powerful because that's all spending. But when you cut people's taxes, they don't spend all of it. They save part of it. And so it becomes a little bit weakened. All right, so just to make that clear, and again, to risk having to draw things with this kind of malfunctioning device, that tax cut might have resulted in an aggregate demand curve moving maybe that far. The same amount of money foregone, instead of spending 5 billion, cutting taxes by 5 billion, by spending the 5 billion, you can make aggregate demand move even farther. Right? The GDP is going to be higher than the GDP increase from a tax cut. Maybe I should write that. That would be the tax cut. That would be G. G would be at 520. The tax cut one would have only been at 515. All right. All right, so let's take an actual example. The most recent quote-unquote Great Recession. And you could see the Great Recession graphically, those negative percentages, right? GDP was dropping, the economy was actually shrinking. That was the problem, right? So Obama comes along and he passes, along with Congress, the stimulus package, $787 billion worth of combined tax cuts, which are things that Republicans tend to like, and spending increases, which are things that Democrats tend to like. And you can see what those spending increases were. A lot of it was just giving money to states so that they can spend money. But a lot of it, that green area in the graph, is road construction projects, bridge construction projects. And again, that money gets spent, workers get paid, they go out to eat at restaurants, the waitresses and waiters get paid, and on it goes. That's the idea. So you can think of Obama's stimulus package and that entire whole project as essentially being about the movement of one line, right? Aggregate demand was too low. By cutting taxes and spending more money, they tried to make aggregate demand move to the right. That's a move to the right. Ignore that little down arrow. And by making aggregate demand move to the right, they can make the things that we actually care about change. GDP goes up and employment goes up, and that was the idea. And if you look at the data, cause and effect and correlation you have to talk about, but that was at least the goal for the data. All right. Now, I'm going to, for the most part, let you try to think through the opposite problem. But the opposite problem would be when aggregate demand were too high. And we haven't seen that recently, but it's possible and it's happened in history. Right? If aggregate demand is too high, there's another kind of fiscal policy, the opposite kind of fiscal policy that they'll do, and that's called contractionary fiscal policy. I think of contractionary as making things smaller, right? So we're trying to bring down aggregate demand. There's too much spending in the economy. So when there's too much spending and we experience things like inflation, the government can use those same two tools, but now use them in reverse. And again, liberals and conservatives would flip around now. We could cut government spending, which conservatives might like, and reduce aggregate demand, or we could raise taxes, take money away from people so that they stop spending money. Increase taxes, which liberals might like, depending on who those people were who were getting taxed. So if aggregate demand is too high, and just finishing up here, and again, graphically, I'm hoping this is making sense at this point. If aggregate demand is too high, ideally, maybe we can even make aggregate demand get pushed to the left by like the perfect amount and wind up exactly where we want to wind up, which is like right there. By cutting government spending or raising taxes, we can achieve the reduction of that level of inflation and get us to still at full employment. All right, so I'm pretty sure that's the end of this screencast. I just have to check here. Yeah, I guess it is. I do have to say a little bit about the sloths. I have to apologize for the sloths. For some reason, I'm just having this thing about sloths, and I'm making you suffer through my fascination. So, apologies.
This is a very unusual sight. A sloth in a hurry. It wants to defecate, and the only place it's happy doing that, oddly enough, is down on the ground. It only does it about once a week. But why does it come down to the ground to do it? And why does it nearly always choose to do so in exactly the same place?